Hi, Happy New Year. It's Rebecca, I eat books. I'm here to talk to you about my favorite books I ate this year. First of all, I couldn't narrow it down, so I'm going to talk about 20 books. I'm going to talk briefly about 20 different books. It's like mid-January, so I'm probably the last person on the internet to talk about their favorite books of the year, so you probably don't care anymore. But here we are, by no demand whatsoever, my favorite books of 2021. Let's do it. So I have 16 fiction books and 4 nonfiction books to talk about. I'm going to talk about them in no relevant order of any kind, but I will save my favorite book of the year for last. I do think I have a favorite. One absolute favorite that I just really loved this year. All right, let's do it. Here we go. The first 3 books that I want to talk about are The Mayor of Leipzig by Rachel Kushner, Second Place by Rachel Cusk, and Pure Color by Sheila Heti. Pure Color by Sheila Heti does not come out until 2022. It's the only book on this list that is not yet out, but absolutely phenomenal, and I highly recommend that you pre-order it. I'm grouping these 3 books together because they're all concerned with questions of the value of art criticism, and what it means to criticize art. In the Heti book, I think art really means existence. The questions of art criticism are really the questions of being a critical thinker, of being a person of consciousness on the planet. I haven't talked about this book yet because I just read it in December, so I will say I loved it. I did feel like it was a little uneven. It has multiple selves within it, and not all of them were as successful for me, but overall, it was great. It is weird, as Sheila Heti often is. There is a beautiful metaphor for depression and suicidal tendencies. There is this overarching metaphor for art as life. There is this timelessness about the book. It seems to me to be both pre-cell phones and post-climate apocalypse simultaneously. I think this book was the most hopeful take on acceptance of the impending end of human society that I've ever read. I really loved it. Okay, the other 2, Second Place and Mayor of Leipzig. This is a tiny novella that, like many of the books that we're going to talk about today, genre breaking, would fall into the realm of metafiction. This book breaks the fourth wall, speaks about Rachel Kushner, the author, in third person, and this book satirizes the art world, the value that is placed on art in the art world. Like also a lot of the books on this list, it's very small. Economy of language and delivering a fully fledged thematic punch in a small book is a real skill. Definitely happens here. And this was one of my absolute favorite books of the year. At the halfway point in June, I said it was my favorite fiction book of the year so far. I don't know if that's still true, but it's definitely up there. We can all agree that end of the year lists and wrap-ups by publications like the New York Times are bullshit. They mean nothing. They're silly. But also, this book was robbed. This book did not appear on nearly enough lists as it should have. Justice for Second Place. This book is great. This book is about a woman who brings a painter to her home in the countryside on a marsh to have him use his art to represent the beauty that she loves about her surrounding, to represent her life in his art. She loves his art, she loves her home, and she wants to see her home through his eyes. Unfortunately, it does not go as planned. It does not go well. This is based on a real-life story about D.H. Lawrence in New Mexico. There is so much here about art, but also gender. The difference between the experience of making art when you are the gender that creates life, the difference between art and truth, the obligation to make one or the other. Lots of questions and themes and nuance in this book. All right. The next 2 books I want to talk about are both extremely sexy books, which is another theme that I noticed in some of my favorites this year. Written on the Body by Jeanette Winterson and Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux. I don't have the Ernaux with me right now. It is with Pure Color in its new home. You know I loved it when I gave it away. Written on the Body. This is a weird book. We have a nameless genderless narrator. A lot of the talk about this book on the internet focuses on the fact that there is no hint whatsoever about the gender of this narrator. It seems extremely obvious to me that this narrator is a woman. This is one of the most feminist pieces of literature that I have ever read. This narrator is in love with a woman who is married to a man. They fall in love and have an affair, and that woman is sick with cancer, the married woman. This book is very concerned with the human body, both how it is constructed, how much pleasure can be derived from it, and also how it can turn on you like cancer, be your demise, how it can be both of those things at the same time. And this book is the most feminist portrayal of seeing a woman's body as a sexual object without the male gaze whatsoever. I noted lots of funny one-liners and little bits and pieces throughout this book. There's a point at which one of the characters has created a paper mache snake that bites off penises at your front door when you ring the doorbell if you're a man. There's a scene where our narrator's sitting on the bus and is headed to the zoo, and there are all the women with their children, wondering why the labor of women isn't included in the gross national product of a nation. There are very few male characters, as this narrator is discussing mainly this one relationship with this one woman with whom they are deeply in love. They are also reflecting on many other relationships that they have had, using them to think about the patterns and put it in context. And the only relationship that this narrator has had with a man, he said to her, "You'd be perfect if you were smaller." So again, phenomenal, 5-star. I'm gonna say that about all of them. You know that I loved them because they're on this list, but I really loved this book. Also, this book was extremely sexy. At one point in the middle of the book, the narration splits. So we have 100 pages of narrative, plot, progression, and then it splits. And there's a section called The Cells, Tissues, Systems, and Cavities of the body, the skin, the skeleton, etc. Tissue, the dermis, the epidermis, the skeleton, the clavicle, the scapula. It gets to nose and then taste. This person is describing the body of their lover through all these things. So describing their lover's skeleton, their lover's skin, and then when it gets to taste, they're describing how their lover tastes. There is a metaphor around an olive pit that absolutely 100% the sexiest thing I have ever read in my whole entire life. So read it just for that. And then after this middle period passage where it describes things, the narrative picks back up. And I love a book that does weird things with form. And then Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux, translated from the French. I mentioned this in my November wrap-up, I think I did. Also tiny, very slim book, delivers in a very short amount. I think it's 96 pages. It is a reflection on a relationship. Begins in a way that makes you think perhaps that it is about grieving the end of this affair, when in fact it's really a meditation on writing and how writing can be used to process emotions and reclaim time and periods of your life. Has a strong point of view in a very small amount of pages. Another book that appears to be about grief, but then really is about the power of words and the ability of writing to reclaim your narrative and to process your feelings, and that was The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. I loved this book too. Another piece of meta fiction. In the second to last chapter, breaks down the fourth wall and says this is actually a book about a book. It's very smart while also being extremely pure and sweet and sad. Great book. We are moving right along. The 6th book on my list of favorite books this year, another tiny book, Signs Preceding the End of the World by Yuri Herrera, translated from Spanish. This book is an allegory about death. The central metaphor here is about immigration, leaving your home country as a type of death. This book does a lot of weird things with language, which I love. It's making very strong choices about the words that it uses. Again, the economy of language is so strong here. Every single word is chosen very purposefully. This book also, I felt like reading it is like picking up on tiny breadcrumbs throughout. It wants you to know that every little detail is there for a reason. I think you could reread this book and get a lot out of it on the second and third reread, noticing all these tiny things. I think this is a great book for discussion, for a book club, talking about the different ways that you read into the central allegory. Dark and creepy, and we have a badass female protagonist, and this was great. Okay, the next two books are also really metafiction, books about books, books about writing, books concerned with the art of writing. There are also books in which nothing happens. I talk about not liking books where nothing happens often, but sometimes nothing happens, but in these books, nothing happens. Okay, nothing. And I love that. I had a professor in college. I'm going off on a tangent here, but stick with me. I had a professor in college refer to Judaism as a religion of pots and pans, because in Judaism, when practicing Judaism, you are praying often to these tiny things. At the beginning of the meal, you pray to the wine and the loaf of bread. You're doing all of these little routines. To me, pond was like a worshiping of pots and pans, cataloging the things that surround you and make up your life. The central thesis of this book to me seems to be our lives are made up of the things around us, the pond and the sign around the pond and the ottoman in our living room and the purse that we bought at the flea market. That is what makes up an existence at the end of the day. And because she being Claire Louise Bennett and our narrator, so carefully observing and cataloging each thing, some of her observations are incredibly frivolous and sort of funny, and some are extremely profound and meaningful. And the idea is that life is both of those things, a collection of all of these pieces. Some people say that this is a collection of short stories. I think it's a novel in pieces. Does it matter which of those two things it is? It really doesn't. It does not matter at all. The other book that is really nothing happens and is just like about the little pieces that make up a life is The Hour of the Star by Clarice Lispector. Another tiny book, really meta, very weird. We have a narrator who is not involved in the story, is observing a young woman named Maccabea. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. This woman is unlucky, ugly, poor, and loves Coca-Cola, and doesn't know how unfortunate they are, isn't miserable enough in the eyes of our narrator for the lot that she's been given in life. This book has one of the most perfect closing lines in all of literature, as far as I'm concerned. And you're gonna have to read it yourself. All right, we are cruising, we are moving along. The next book that I read, that I loved, was Light Years by James Salter. First of all, also a very sexy book, great sex scenes. This book is about a marriage, a long marriage. It catalogs this marriage for decades, the perspective ping-pongs between the two people in the marriage over the course of the marriage, and grapples with each of their own pursuit of joy and happiness, what brings meaning to their lives. This was an important reading experience for me in my reading evolution this year. This book is older. It's written by a white man in the 70s. As I was reading it, there were definitely pieces that made me uncomfortable, and I thought like, and at the end, I closed this book and I said, this was a perfect novel. To get to a place in my reading experience where I can love and cherish a book that isn't every bite goes down smoothly or is equally as delicious is something I've learned about myself as a reader this year. I think this applies to this book. It applies to Pure Color. I love that I am able to metabolize books in a more complicated way than I have as a previous iterations of my reading self. Did I say what this book is about? This book has some of the best sentences that I read this year. The next two on the list are two perfect examples of the modern, sad, finky woman. questioning late-stage capitalism, injustice of motherhood and gender politics in America, questioning the value of being a thinky person. Is there an overt value to being a person concerned with knowledge? And that is The Life of the Mind by Christine Smallwood and Want by Lynn Steger Strong. Both these books have female narrators in the world of academia, struggling to get by. Lots about female friendship, the power of bringing women together. I think that these are two of the most sort of contemporary reading books on this list. Both Life of the Mind and Want are pretty dark in the way that they refuse to sugarcoat the very dark realities of modern American womanhood. All right, 3 fictions left. No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. First of all, like I said with other ones, like, what is this book? It is genre defying. It creates its own new way of being in the world. This is again a book that when I started it, I was like, I'm not sure I get it. I'm not sure I like it. As I'm sure you've heard this described, it's written in tweets. It's a fragmentary book, and then it really shifts, and the second half of the book is incredibly sad, beautifully written, asks questions about the future of humanity on this planet, the value of love and family, the purity of children. And this book really stuck with me. When I first read it, I wouldn't have guessed necessarily that it would make it onto this list, but I have thought a lot about this and returned to this a lot throughout the year. I read this pretty early on. I think I read this in February, right when it came out, maybe March. It's great. Higher Ground by Anke Stelling, translated from German. This takes place in Berlin. This is a book very much about class consciousness and criticizing capitalism, thinking about how no one is faultless in a capitalist system. No one is completely the good guy or the bad guy. This book pokes fun at privilege, but also at the ignorance of the varieties of forms that privilege can take. This book's main theme is around what is home, what counts as a home, how does one make a home, which is a question I really enjoy reading about. What I really loved about this book was how unlikable our characters are. I like a book that can make you hate the characters and love the story. I think that's not easy, and Anke Stelling succeeds. Another book in which you definitely won't love your character is Asylum Road. This is the last fiction book on my list of favorites this year, and I read this in December, I think. What is time? This book follows our narrator, who is unhinged. She is a refugee from the Balkan Wars. This book thinks about conflict, the expression of inner conflict and inner turmoil on the national scale of civil war. So we have the micro within, the macro on the national stage, and then the medium of in a relationship between a man and a woman. Conflict reverberates and trauma extends through all of these layers. This book asks the question of, can you make a family of your own if you don't come from a family? Can you find inner peace if you come from conflict? This book is funny and smart, so smart, has a phenomenal ending, and the unhinged woman at the center of this book feels very much like a Ferrante character. Classic Ferrante women who are just made crazy by society and act out hysteria. That is who I think is at the center of this book. Okay, those were my fiction choices of the year. Let's talk about my favorite nonfiction reads. Okay, first we have a pretty traditional memoir, The Cost of Living by Deborah Levy. This is the second of the 3 books in the Living Autobiography series. I read all 3 of them this year. This one, the middle one, was by far and away the strongest one for me. Levy is recently divorced and is figuring out how to make a home and make a life and make art in a newly independent way. She finds a room of her own. She finds freedom of movement through this electric bike. She's having like a real personal renaissance. She's also very concerned with the theme of motherhood, both reflecting on her own mother and thinking about her obligations and abilities to her own children. And motherhood is a theme that I really like to read about. I sent a copy of this to my mother after I read it. She liked it too. I also loved all three of the books in the series for insight into craft, especially as someone who has read some Levy novels. It's fun to hear them referenced and hear sort of about the genesis of those books in this process, but also just the art of writing, the act of writing. This is like the pop-up video, VH1 pop-up video. Does that make sense? Anyway, here's a quote she writes about writing. "The appeal of writing, as I understood it, was an invitation to climb in between the apparent reality of things, to see not only the tree but the insects that live in its infrastructure, to discover that everything is connected in the ecology of language and living." That's so good. The next two books are Blueberries by Elena Savage and The Undocumented Americans by Carla Cornejo Villavicencio. These are two phenomenal examples, again, of defying genre. This book is a collection of very smart essays you've heard me talk about before that I absolutely love. Every essay is written in a different medium. The scope that Savage portrays here is very impressive to me. The uncomfortable questions she seeks to explore and the lack of answers, the ability to resist giving answers to those questions, I found to be commendable, undeniable. The Undocumented Americans is not a collection of essays. It is one narrative in which she travels to different parts of the country to speak with undocumented Americans and recognize the experience that they are having. By that description, it sounds like sort of a piece of journalism, and I would discredit any characterization of this as journalism. It is very personal. She inserts herself, she discusses her own family, but also she embeds herself with her subjects. She, in some parts, is the story. And also, the hottest tip I can possibly give you is you need to follow this author on Instagram. She really, truly has one of the best, weirdest Instagram accounts of all time. You're welcome. It's time for my favorite book of the year. We made it. My favorite book of the year was Journal of a Solitude by May Sarton. This is also an autobiography. It is 1 year of journal entries written by the poet May Sarton. She was a feminist, lesbian poet and author. In this book, she is living remotely in a snowy cabin in New Hampshire, reflecting on what it means to be alone, what it means to find joy in writing, work, growing things in your garden, and taking care of your own existence and being self-sufficient. It is beautiful. I read it in October. It meant a lot to me. I will forever associate this book with the changing of seasons, the beauty of fall here in New England. As somebody who doesn't love winter and when it gets cold, learning to accept things that are not overtly comfortable or easy for their complicated beauty is, I think, the lesson of this book. The complicated and not always easy, but rewarding existence alone. And I love this so much. All right, for the record, I read 98 books this year. Does it kill me? I was 2 off. An even 100? Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. But that's okay. Next year, we're gonna break triple digits. Thought a little bit about my goals for next year. Actually, we might not break triple digits because my big goal is to not be afraid of big books like I often am. I definitely shy away from big books. This year, I'm leaning into reading thicker books and accepting that they're gonna take me a little longer. And so my numbers might be lower next year. Numbers don't matter. All right, thank you for watching. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate everyone who has watched this year, and I hope you have a beautiful year, and I hope your 2022 is full of So many good books. Love you, nerd.